In this video we are going to look at how to create something like this, where we have items that get recycled inside of a container and animate from left to right. And I have 4 divs in this container. They all have a text, so item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. And as you can see, they are cycling through continuously in this container. So how do we do that? First, a little bit of theory. So I have a container that has a set width, and each item that I have is half the width of the container. And what we want to do is take these items and flow it through the container one width at a time. So that would be 400 pixels. Now eventually, if I keep doing that, I'm going to start running into some problems here. So hurdle number 1 is to just start off with the layout so that it fits this model. So we know that the container is 800 pixels, which means that each div is 400 pixels. So because we know that each div is 400 pixels, we know that half of this div will be visible, and then one full div will also be invisible. So there's 400 over here plus a half of this one, so that gives us a starting position of minus 600 pixels. So we start off with all of that, and then what we want to do is move these items up to the right, take the last item, remove it from the DOM and reinsert it before our first item. And then we continue with this cycle every time round, taking the item at the back and placing it back in the front. This will enable us to have this seamless rotation of elements without entering that white space. I'm not necessarily going to explain every excruciating detail here. I'm just going to highlight some landmarks for you. First of all, the container, like we said, has this fixed width and height. We're going to be doing absolute positioning inside of it, so we want to set the position to relative, and we're also setting the overflow to hidden so that we don't see the elements recycling on the outside of the container. We want to hide the stuff that's not in the container's view. Then we also have a transition on our divs that we want to animate, where we're saying translate the items for us, take 0.5 seconds for the transition, and I want to ease out. Internally, we're going to do the translate on codes. We'll have a look at that. And then this is just some cosmetic stuff so we can actually see each individual item. But the important part here is that it's absolutely positioned, and we've set the top and the left to be 0, just making that a little bit easier for us. The next thing that we need to get a handle on is the fact that we need to call the code at a particular interval. So in this case, every 1 second I want to move the stuff to the right. And to be able to do that, we use the set interval function, which will then give us a variable that we can use to clear the interval again. It's important on things like set timeout and set interval to clear those items to prevent memory leaks and also other bugs from appearing. Note that set interval has 2 parameters. The first parameter is a function that we want to call. If I don't bind this to this, then I might have some problems on this function where the keyword this means the window, and we don't want it to mean the window, we want it to mean this class. So this is just stock standard binding that we're using here. And then we set the delay, that's in milliseconds, so 1000 milliseconds is a second, and that's the delay that we want to do. So how this will function is that it'll call this function, it'll then wait for a second and call that function again, and then wait for a second and call that function again, and it'll continue doing so until you actually clear the interval. I've got an update function here. This is just to calculate the starting position. So I've already explained how we got to the value 600. And then we just loop through the items and go and set the initial position. Two things to note here. I want to make it simple for myself, and so I want to know where this current item is. So I'm setting the dataset.x to the current x position of that element, and then I'm using translate to actually physically go and set the position, and that's also the value that we're going to animate. Note here that you don't want to set the left, set the translate, because this will give you hardware acceleration. All the meat is in the move right function, and here we're using set timeout, and this is the only sort of tricky bit to this, but let's just try and break it down into small bits. The first set timeout that we're using, we're putting no delay on it, and the reason why we're using the set timeout is so that we can create a micro task for our animation to sit on. It just helps us prevent the UI thread from locking when we want to do that transition. The second thing is that our animation takes half a second to move the items to the right, and we want to be able to remove the item that has become invisible at the end and move it to the front. So I can't do that until my animation is finished. So the second timeout waits for half a second, so 500 milliseconds, and then it goes and moves the element from the back to the front. Right, so this is why we have the two timeouts. Timeout number one is to create a task for us to prevent UI locking, and then the second one is a delay so that we can perform some operation after the animation is done. Let's just look at the movement. So go and get the element in the container, get the x position that we set in the data.x, increase that value by 400, and set the translate so that it moves up by 400 pixels. And we do that for every element. So that's rather elementary. The second one is a little bit more interesting, where we're saying go and get me the last element in the container and remove it. So I can't move an element if I haven't first removed it from the container and then reinsert it into its new position. Now this is another interesting bit here, is that you have last child and last element child. Don't get confused between the two. What you want to use in this case is the last element child. If you use last child, you might move the text element that gets inserted in the DOM, and you don't want to do that. So take special note of the last element child. Same as last element child, you also have a first element child. So the logic is take the last element child, remove it from the container, and then insert it before the first element child. So each element that has children in it has a function called insert before, and it takes two parameters: the new element that you want to add, and then the element you want to insert it before of. And because we want to add it before the first element child, that's what we use here. And then when we remove the child, note that it will return to you the element that was removed, and we reuse that again to go and set the initial values of where this thing needs to be. Because of the fact that we use this inside of our update loop, if we don't do this, it won't actually work. So remember to reset it to the initial state when you move it across. And that's really it. It's fairly easy to do, but let me just highlight the key points that you should know again. First of all, the set interval function. It's really important for you to know, and it's important for you to know that you should clear your interval as well. The second one is set timeout. It's a very useful function to know from a performance and from a timing perspective. The set timeout again also has the function to call, and then the delay of don't call this function immediately, only call it after this delay. Then we want to take note of the property called last element child and first element child to be able to get the first and last elements in my container. And then the last function to take note of is the insert before, where we say I have a container with elements. I'm going to tell you what element I want to insert this item before, and the rest is just glue.